that's a yikes.
Whenever you are ready.
Alrighty, so, hey guys, I'm Christian, and today I'm gonna be talking about 3DS hacking. So who am I? I'm Christian Voorhies, also known as Crimson Maple. So what gives me any qualifications to talk about any of this? Well, nothing really. I was basically just a script kiddie back then, but I was really interested in the 3DS hacking scene when I was younger, and that's really what got me into InfoSec and hacking as a whole. So I wanted to give a little bit of a talk on it. Some of my hobbies include doing art stuffs, going outdoors, hiking, skiing particularly, and of course, gaming. Why else would I be hacking the 3DS if it weren't for gaming? There's a link to my GitHub if you're interested in any of the previous things that I've done for 3DS hacking. And yeah. So let's get into this. So the 3DS timeline can be broken down into about 4 different distinct parts. One of those being the origins, which is primarily like bodge job hacks. Any sort of like consistency with like hacking was very loose. There's a lot of really loosely strung together tutorials, and everything was overly complicated as you needed at least 18 bajillion different tools in order to even get low-level access. That's a lie, but it's also very true. And then there's the ARM9 loader hacks era, which is the beginning of really where everything started to streamline itself. Everything began becoming a little more advanced, a little more streamlined, but you still had incredibly convoluted talks and incredibly convoluted tutorials in order to even set up some of this lower level access. Then there's the golden era, you only needed like 4 different tools, and people started speedrunning 3DS hacking. And I'm not even joking when people say they got times down to like 10 minutes on taking a stock modded console all the way to latest exploit stuff. And now there is the modern era, wherein you can do literal hacking in just a few minutes using boot ROM level exploits on the 3DS. But today, we're going to be talking about the beginnings, the origins, some of the most basic exploits on this console for low-level access, but also some of the most complicated tutorial content. So to begin this, we're going to need to talk about the hardware of the console. So the 3DS was built on 2 different ARM-based CPUs, one of those being a 2 or 4 core ARM MP core CPU. This is our main processor, which in all the console was basically running. This is the powerhouse of the 3DS. And the only reason why there is 2 different models of this is because there are 2 models of the 3DS, specifically the old 3DS and the new 3DS, with the old 3DS being a beefed up, essentially put the old 3DS on steroids version, where they upped the clock speeds basically 8 times over for each core as well, meaning it was able to run new games, and basically they were able to downscale and kind of port over some Wii U titles, or not Wii U titles, Wii titles, onto the 3DS to give it an example of the kind of oomph that they wanted to give to this console, but weren't able to fully like dream up until the Switch. Then we have the ARM9 processor, the ARM946. This is basically our security processor on this console. Everything goes through this ARM9 process, or this ARM9 CPU. It has access to literally everything, with being able to access everything from the virtual, or from the VRAM from the GPU, down to its own internal memory we call AxiRAM. The ARM9 is basically known for being able to control everything, including the SD, the NAND, and some of the low-level crypto functions and such. It's got access to, this is basically, if you get this CPU and you get into this is the lowest level that you can get. And the 3DS also had around 256 megabytes of FC RAM, which is our user space RAM, and 6 megabytes of VRAM consistent across both consoles. And I got to give credit here. This diagram was actually made by the amazing people, Smea, Derek, and Pluto. They are absolute whizzes when it comes to the 3DS. I highly recommend that you look at some of their work. So this is the security system of the 3DS, or at least in theory, this is what the security levels look like. We've got our ARM9 userland, or ARM11 userland, which is basically the user space in which we will first break out of, or break into, essentially. This is the sandbox. This is where all your games, all your applications are run, like the web browser and all that other such things. Then there's the next level in, which is ARM11 kernel, which gives us full access over the ARM11 and all of its, essentially, it gives us access to everything that the ARM11 has to offer. So that means access into all the user space RAM. That gives us access into the virtual RAM. And essentially, from here, we're able to do a lot more deep diving into the console and begin reversing it a little further. And in theory, we have the ARM9 userland and then the ARM9 kernel. These are like the holy level. This is, we have access to most of the console. But there's a small catch. Getting ARM9 userland is the same thing as getting ARM9 kernel. So it's fantastic. There's, in theory, 4 layers of security. There's really not. We have this custom service call, or not custom, but a service call built into the function, or into the ARM9 kernels, called SVC backdoor, is what we call it, or SVC OX7B. This service call allows you to execute userland code in the ARM9 as kernel mode code. So basically, if you got into the userland, you have access to the ARM9 kernel code. So this is really what it looks like. So that takes our exploit number from 4 down to 3. So we're going to talk about some of the exploits on this console. First, we need to break out of the userland. But that's not really what I'm here to talk about today. There are people like Pluto, or not Pluto, Smea have amazing talks on some of their userland exploits. Other people like Mr. Nibayo, and I think Yellow's 8 did one as well. They do fantastic talks on userland exploits and are so much more qualified to talk about this code than I am, as I was more focused on lower level code. But some of the basic overview is some of the major targets for these userland escapes were save game exploits, and we used wrap code in order to escape them and like take over targets such as the web browser or the home menu in order to gain code execution. In addition to WebKit being the biggest target of them all, as the 3DS uses a bodged together version of old WebKit. So let's get into the meat and potatoes of this talk. We're going to start targeting the ARM11X kernel. So here we can see there's a service call. This service call is called control memory. And Nintendo did something really, really dumb here. They mapped memory into the user space, or literally anywhere in memory, before they read from it. So that means, basically, they map it, we can modify it, and it will be read by the console. So with very precise timing, we can essentially take over this portion of memory that we map into user space, in theory. But it requires very specific timing. So let's do a brief dive into one of the implementations of this exploit. This exploit is known as memchunks hacks, as we're literally reading the memory chunks of the ARM11 kernel into user space. So let's boil it down. We're going to need to do specific timing, as I said. And the best way to do this is through threading, or a bodge job of threading on the 3DS. So this implementation isn't exactly the cleanest implementation, as we are literally using sleep threads in order to make it so that the processor doesn't kill the primary thread before it finishes executing. But we'll ignore that for the most part. It could be improved and it could be made better. But what we're going to do here is we're going to use this faulty service code called control memory. And we're going to use that to allocate the memory from the ARM11 kernel. This is going to essentially just read through it all, map it into user space. And we're going to do this through threading and make sure that we can map it into memory. And from here, we're going to then check to see if our memory is there using a service call called arbitrate address. Arbitrate address will essentially check to see if the memory is allocated, at least for our purposes. It's not exactly meant for that, but we use it like that because it just makes the process a lot easier, because then we know that our kernel space is there. And we're going to overwrite parts of something known as the vtable that we're going to be mapping in from the kernel space. And we're going to be hijacking this memory chunk and overwriting it with our own function pointers from a vtable. And this is going to give us code execution on the kernel level once it's written back into the kernel, when we close down all the vtable pointers and all that such. So now that we've done that, we are going to essentially read the, oh God, I did not brush up on this enough. So essentially, we are going to, once we've taken over these kernel pages, we are going to map it into memory and set our vtable equal to our new memory address, or set the new memory address equal to our vtable. And once that is done, it's going to call our KM1 stage 1. This is essentially going to patch the kernel, and it's going to allow us to run our own code. And essentially, through some extra level stuff, we're going to take over some processes, and we're going to essentially give ourselves a little bit more of a foothold. But at this point, in particular, we should have access to SVC backdoor. And SVC backdoor, so depending on your kernel level or your userland level, SVC backdoor can only elevates within that level. So in theory, if we have SVC backdoor on ARM11 user mode, we will then have kernel mode. And that's exactly what happens here. At the point of KM1 finishing, we will have SVC backdoor. And from later in the code, we will execute this backdoor, and we are free to execute ARM11 kernel code. Pwned. So there's not a, this exploit next coming up is our ARM9 exploit. And this exploit is so incredibly dumb and simple. I am surprised that Nintendo even missed it. Essentially, what happened here is initially during boot up, the ARM9 would go to read the firm header, and it would try to map it into space, or into memory space. All is going well. Nothing in theory should be going on at boot time, but Nintendo never expected people to get access to the ARM11. So it maps it into ARM11 user mode space, which the ARM11 also has access to. So it's going to read the firm header into user mode memory. And we're essentially going to be able to modify all that code and modify the ARM11 boot, or the firm header, to execute our own binaries. So let's do a kind of brief deep dive into this. Basically, it's going to copy our payload into memory, and then we're going to create a patch for the ARM11 kernel on boot. essentially what this patch will do is it'll point our, instead of pointing our firm launch towards the actual Nintendo firmware, it's going to instead point it to our own ARM9 binary, which will be slightly modified in such a way that allows our Nintendo firmware to boot as well, so that we can have enough of the processes that we can, actually do something with our ARM9 binaries. And then it's going to reboot into memory. Essentially, what you see here on screen is about the extent of the entire exploit. There's a little bit more in-depth assembly code, particularly in the function patch hook, which is specifically overtaking the boot code and all that such stuff. But I really didn't think that I would have enough time to talk about it. Turns out it was wrong. But essentially, we're going to use this jump table, and we are going to execute our ARM9 binary on a reboot code, on a reboot function. And we have ARM9 access. It's so dumb and it's so simple. I'm surprised that nobody got it or found this bug. But yeah, so that's the end of my talk. It was really brief, and I'm sorry about that. There's so much more here. There's a lot more technical-minded and smart people out there, and I highly recommend that you check out specifically Smea, Derek, and Pluto. They did an amazing 3.2 C3 talk. It is absolutely amazing, huge resource in this project. And I'd like to thank everyone else here, Yellows 8, Steve Ice, MidKid, all of them for their implementations of this exploit. And most of all, thank you everyone for coming here or watching this on stream. Y'all are awesome. And here are a bunch of links to all their code and all their stuff that I used in writing this whole slide. So, Joe.
First time presenting as well.
Oh.
I'll give you the lanyard.
Thank
you for presenting.
Yeah.
Honorary lanyard. Thank you for presenting.
Yeah, of course.
I'm going to do news.